I think it's maybe like the third time I've actually tied a tie in all these years. I have no idea how well I did it.
It looks good.
Okay.
You look good.
Well, the institution that's sponsoring the program is the New York Theological Seminary. I have about 10 textbooks already. So that's just for the first half. The program offers a master's in professional studies, which prepares you to do community work, ministry, counseling, organizing, and educational curriculums. The plan that everybody knew was that there's a concert at Roseland, a big event, and that's where we're headed. During our train ride, there must have been at least 50 of us. When we finally got to the train station, all of us filed out of the train car. I happened to be with a girl whose twin was speaking with Johnny during the train ride. So I proceeded to go up the stairs to leave the train station, but I didn't see where the girl I was talking to on the train, where she had went to. So I decided to go back downstairs and check. At this point, I met someone who I knew as Kevin. And Kevin indicated to me that, listen, we need a lookout. We're about to get paid. What was odd for me was that it was so many of them. So I went back up the stairs, about halfway up the stairs, to see if any of the cops were coming or anything like that. Within seconds, it was complete chaos.
The Watkins family came from Provo, Utah, so they could watch tennis at the U.S. Open. At about 10 p.m. September 2, 1990, while Pascual Carpenter stood as a lookout, a part of the group of teens headed to Roseland attacked the family on the subway platform. The father, Sherman Watkins, was knocked to the ground. His back pocket and buttocks were slashed, and $200 were taken from him. The mother, Karen, was thrown to the ground and kicked in the chest and face. Brian, one of two sons, went to help his mother. He struggled with and then chased Yul Gary Morales. Morales stabbed him in the heart.
From my vantage point, I could see that there were people scrambling, some people were on the floor. Finally, there were some people that were running towards me. So I ran along with them.
Brian, not realizing he'd been injured, chased the retreating teens up the stairs, followed by his brother, Todd. Brian collapsed on the token booth level of the subway station. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital and pronounced dead at 10:46 p.m. He was just 22 years old. 8 teens were arrested for the attack. They were split into 2 groups and tried separately in 2 trials. 7 of the teens, including Morales, were convicted of second-degree murder under the controversial felony-murder rule.
At its core, the felony-murder rule is the idea that if you take part in a felony in which someone is killed, you can be convicted of murder.
The charges were dismissed for the lone defendant who never signed or videoed a confession. The 7 remaining defendants received the maximum penalty, 25 years to life.
My thoughts have been full of regrets. And I accept full responsibility for my role in the incident and fully admit that I willfully took part in a robbery that I knew that was wrong.
Despite the shocking nature of the crime and the horrible death of Brian Watkins, there are 23 reasons why 23 years is enough.
He believed
that it was going to be this group of guys who was just going to kind of push these people around and take their wallet and be gone. And I think it escalated beyond anything, sadly, that he could have imagined. And he certainly wasn't present when the actual act took place.
The decision-making process that kids enter into is really different than adults, in part because they're more impulsive, they're more reckless. They don't have the same future orientation that an adult does. So when a kid is deciding whether or not to do something, they're looking much more at the immediate rewards and much less at the long-term impact that may have.
Pascual's defense attorney asserted, and even the prosecutor, Thomas Shields, conceded that Pascual was unarmed. Shields produced no evidence that he was anything other than a lookout. By the prosecutor's own admission, Pascual did not kill anyone.
When speaking to Morales, that he told me that it was intentional, it was accidental. He said that he was just trying to scare the guy to back away from him. For a long time, I hated Gary for making that fateful decision to brandish a knife.
They do these kind of interrogations where they twist words and they put words in people's mouths, and I think getting people to point fingers at other people and making promises, and these are kind of traditional interrogation techniques that cops are taught.
The police are legally entitled to lie to people, and they lied through their teeth constantly, a point which was never raised at trial. You have to understand what these detectives, their job was to put this group together and to make sure that each implicated all of the exact number and names of the other guys. There were a bunch of other people who were arrested and released who were probably involved with this crime, but whose names they couldn't sort of triangulate. Once they got their list assembled, with each interview, they kept sort of feeding the names to the individuals, so to make sure that they had their one list, to keep that cohesive.
They said that, okay, we need to get this down on paper. Detective Gonzalez, he instructed for me how to start it. He said, write the date, put your date of birth, your name, I so-and-so am making the following statement. And then he would say, for example, okay, so you got to the station with 6 other people, right? And I would say, yeah. They say, write that down. So I'd write that down. And you, with this group, decided that you were going to rob these group of people, right? I say, yeah. Write that down. He asked me, and the person that you saw with the butterfly knife was Rockstar. And I said, I guess so. So well, write it down.
That was the nightmare of my life. I didn't know what to do because no one had called me. I didn't even know where to go because they did not allow him to call me at all. So I had to wait, because since it was a holiday, I had to wait for Tuesday to find out what was going on. No one called me, no one said anything to me. And I remember that day, that was the most painful day of my life.
Again, the attorneys didn't even object. They didn't even question the veracity of it. They didn't even raise the idea in the minds of the jury that these detectives might be telling complete fabrications of what actually took place during these interviews.
My family really couldn't afford an attorney. So I was given a court-appointed attorney from the Legal Aid Society.
You know, a teenage kid, parents generally don't know how the law functions and operates. They've put their trust in the public defender's office. They expect that they're going to do the best job that they can, and they don't know that they have legal rights to demand more. In Pascual's case, he got a less than vigorous defense. In the case of one of the other co-defendants, Luis Montero, he got a guy who was assigned counsel and did a fantastic job for him. So fantastic, in fact, he got his charges dropped because he worked very, very hard. So it's kind of the luck of the draw.
The lawyers in this case were pushing a rock up a hill. That this was, the outcome was foretold. You know, this was before the climate of understanding that people falsely confessed to things, that was a reality, and because at the time there was really I was going to say there was very little nuance in the case. There was no nuance in the case.
They played fast and loose with the rules on Miranda back then with all those suspects. What they did with most of the suspects was they questioned them, they got them to make a statement, and then before they had them write it down or videotape it, then they Miranda'd them. So they were interrogated without knowing that they could have a lawyer present. They were not read their rights before they were interrogated.
The only thing I had a chance to do was to sign the form. They filled out everything else. So Miranda was not part of the picture until they got the statements they wanted.
Murder 2 carries a minimum sentence of 15 to life and a maximum sentence of 25 to life, so that there seemed to have been no consideration by the sentencing judge, who by reputation was considered a very tough sentencer and a very pro-prosecution judge, that all of them got 25 to life. So the person who stabbed got the same as the person who looked out.
The Supreme Court has been pretty clear in their felony murder cases that the role that you play in the felony does dictate the sentence that you should receive, so that the person who actually did the killing should be held culpable for the murder, however that should be, but the person who was the lookout or participated only in the robbery should only be culpable for his or her personal level of participation. If
you look at who goes to prison, particularly goes to prison for long sentences, it's impossible not to notice that people of color go in much, much higher percentages than people who are white or Caucasian. People who are poor, low income, is probably 90% of the prison population in the United States. The law, on one hand, has a responsibility of protecting the community. But you can't have law without justice. And justice needs to be individualized.
I remember when he was in trial and then they gave him the 25 years to life. My God, I screamed so loud when they were cuffing him and taking him away. And I was screaming that I love him.
There was one individual who stabbed that kid to death, and everybody got a life sentence over it.
Major cities in the nation are under attack from within. Nowhere are the problems more visible than in New York City, where 2 killings have focused a spotlight of shock on the nation's largest urban area. Bob Fall reports.
New York has gotten so mean and so dangerous, the mayor actually went to church yesterday and pleaded with residents to come out from behind locked doors to help, he said,
against an onslaught by antisocial forces that threaten to tear our city apart.
It was Just about 2 weeks before the Brian Watkins homicide, the first group of the Central Park 5 defendants had been convicted. And that was fresh in the minds of everybody in New York. And I think that sort of, that whole anxiety of gangs, of wilding Black and Hispanic teenagers, you know, wreaking mayhem on the city, had a lot of people nervous at the time and on edge. And the relentless persistence of homicides in the press every day. I mean, when you think about it, well over 2,000 homicides in a year is an average of more than 6 a day. And, you know, the press couldn't even keep up with all the bodies. I have a New York Post headline hanging up in my office that says, "Dave, do something." They jumped on Dinkins with both feet. It was all his problem. They laid all these bodies at his feet and said, you know, and look at these kids in Central Park. Look what they did. And now you got this, you know, we just can't take it anymore.
Critics complain his laid-back style shows the mayor isn't up to the job.
What they had done just shocked the city, and it was aided and abetted by the media and all the public officials who got to have their say in the media about what a heinous crime this was. And in that climate, in that environment, there's no way those boys were ever going to get a fair trial. Normally, when a grand jury indicts a suspect for a homicide charge, the case, the index number of the case is put sort of into a wheel, a physical wheel, and they pull out the number, and it's assigned, they pull the judge's name out, and that judge gets the case. Well, the Office of Court Administration took the very unusual step of assigning this to a specific judge. So, well, he was a former prosecutor from the Bronx. He was also something of a celebrity. He had written a book, a novel that had become a screenplay, and he was working on another one while that trial was going on. And the fact that they selected him specifically was very curious.
If there's been a lot of publicity, if it's been in the papers day after day, if the public's aware about it, the district attorney's office feels a very high need in terms of its own selfish interest to convict, in terms of its reputation to convict, and not only convict, but to secure the highest penalty that's reasonably applicable to the acts alleged.
Judge Torres, who's now retired, was infamous for being considered tough, a very tough judge and a very tough sentencer.
In the 17 years that I was a defense lawyer, I never had an innocent client.
It never what?
Whoa, this raised hackles no end.
Interesting.
So I just want to touch upon that. And apropos of what you said previously about representing the guilty. If you don't represent the guilty, you ain't got no clients. That's the bottom line.
The objections raised by the defense were almost always overruled and almost always sustained for the prosecution. And it got to the point where the judge started sustaining objections for the prosecution before the prosecution even made them. Pascual could have fired his attorney right up until the jury verdict, and they would have had to retry him. And that might have been a smart thing for a guy like him in that position, to get a new trial separated from the rest of it, maybe years after all the publicity had died down. He was also, unfortunately, he was in the first group, which got a lot of publicity. The second group got almost no publicity. You know, they covered the openings, the closings, and the verdicts, and the sentencing. And the first group was gavel-to-gavel coverage. They had cameras and print reporters all over the courtroom, day in and day out. And second trial, you know, the city had moved on, but that first trial was an intense scrutiny by the media, and you can imagine how much that affects how the judge and the jury are going to behave.
You ask me for a ride to the store. All right, and I give you a ride to the store. You go in the store, not only rob the store, but you murder somebody. Am I culpable? Well, under the law, I am. But what is the actual degree of my involvement?
For my office, the applicability of the felony murder rule becomes an issue when the person is appearing before the parole board and there's not an issue of what their individual culpability was in the instant offense they were convicted of. These are adjudicated as murder charges, where the person would receive a sentence of 15 to life as a minimum, going up to 25 to life as a maximum sentence if they're being sentenced for second-degree murder under the felony murder statute. These sometimes are people who sat in a car and was the lookout or the getaway driver and weren't actually involved inside the establishment.
When I started reading some of the commentary by legal scholars and people who were outside of the criminal justice system, people who weren't judges, who weren't prosecutors, and learned what they had to say about the felony murder rule, I was shocked. A large number of people would discredit the felony murder rule as inconsistent with our Constitution, who believed that the felony murder rule had no place in our criminal justice system.
If we've drawn it from the English, we ought to follow the path of the English and abolish that rule. Prosecutorial advocates are unwilling to surrender, no matter how strong the criticism and no matter unfair the outcomes that it creates. The prosecutor has to prove each and every element of the crime. What happens in the implementation of the felony murder rule is that although we would normally require the prosecutor to prove the intent to cause the death of another individual so as to justify a sentence of 25 to life, all that's required is to prove the intent to commit the much lesser, less intrusive, less violent, less impactful underlying felony.
It's easier to convict someone of felony murder than it is manslaughter. It's easier to convict someone of felony murder than it is in a wrongful death suit.
You're supposed to be presumed innocent, obviously, until proven guilty. In a gang scene, with the charge of felony murder, you almost have a standard of guilt by association. And you hold the whole crowd, that can't be justice.
In the United States, we began to develop our criminal justice system into several classes of felony offenses. So, for example, you just didn't have homicide, a homicide offense, and that was it. You had different grades of homicide. You had different grades of manslaughter. You have different grades of murder. So depending on your level of culpability, you could be charged with one and not the other. A person who had a high level of culpability would be charged with a higher level of homicide. But what happens is when you have the felony murder rule, none of that makes any difference.
That the intent of one person is transferred to the other is one way that it's explained, or that a person's bad intent to commit a nonviolent felony, perhaps, is sufficient to create the culpability that is equivalent to an intentional act.
In a crowd like that, you can get some kids that would not have the real ability to personally harm anybody, you know.
Having met and worked with and talked to many people who committed very serious and often very violent crimes as teenagers. I work with some of those people and see them 10, 20, or 30 years later. They are different people.
We make bad choices, we make bad decisions. We're not evil, most of us. I'm not saying there aren't people that are inside that are. But overall, we just made bad choices.
I give you a 25-year to life sentence. I'm saying that after 25 years, I can consider you for release. And so the incentive there is that you're going to rehabilitate yourself because you want to get out at the earliest possible moment.
The second week when I called up, but I was calling the jail almost every day to find out what's going to go on, when can I see my son. When I finally visit him, when I hold him, he was shaking and he was crying and he's telling me, "Mommy, I'm so sorry." And I was crying with him. We were hugging each other for a good 5 minutes. And that's when I told him that I'm going to be there for you. We'll go to the time together. And then he said, "Mommy, I'm going to make you so proud of me."
I needed to take introspection of the person I was and do whatever I can to make that person a better person.
He has taken a horrible thing that happened to him in terms of his incarceration and has probably done more positive things with it than 90% of the men that I know.
I've always had Brian in the back of my mind as a hero because he had the courage to do what I was too cowardly to prevent. I wish I could shake his hand. And tell him how proud I am of his efforts to protect his family. Their anger at me is completely justified, and I accept that. And the only thing that really is a concern for me is my ability to express to them that every bone in my body is extremely sorry that this occurred. So if I could, maybe one day extend a personal apology, and they would allow that opportunity, that would be a very immense step toward redemption.
There is no word to express how sorry I am. Their son did not deserve to die in this condition. That is the most unfortunate things that could ever happen to any mother. And I understand their pain, and I wish I could tell them face to face how sorry I am. I know that will not replace their son by saying I'm sorry, but deeply inside, I feel their pain.
I mean, what happened to that family is unspeakable. And the fact, and I've read over the years statements of compassion and understanding that the Watkins family has made about the people who were charged in the act, that they've done restorative justice work, and they've worked with young people who've been in trouble, and that's very moving to me, that their response to what happened to them and to Brian would result in them wanting to bridge barriers.
When he graduated, he get his diploma from high school while he's been incarcerated. I felt very good about it because I see that he didn't give up. And that was the first thing that I said to him. Education is very important, and if you have to continue your education while you are incarcerated, go ahead and do it. And then he's always told me that he will make me proud.
Eventually, I was able to start a college program at Sing Sing through the Hudson Link for Higher Education. They sponsor a bachelor's program in behavioral science by Mercy College. I completed the associate's program, and then I continued with the bachelor's program, completing that in 2008. I was able to complete an associate's and bachelor's degree in Islamic Studies and Near Eastern Studies from the American Open University. And then I continued with Mercy College, completing that in 2008, summa cum laude. And finally, I was accepted into the New York Theological Seminary to pursue a master's in professional studies, which is what I'm doing right now. I took a job assignment with the pre-release center until I became the resident director of the program. I took almost every program that had to do with violence and to overcome anger, including the AVP programs that the state mandated for me to take. I took those and even decided that I would become a facilitator.
Is not just concerned about himself and his peers, but also deeply concerned about younger men and women. And would work really hard to try to prevent them from making some of the mistakes that he had made as a young man, as a kid really.
He really has gifts. He's a very gifted man. He's a writer, he's a thinker, he's a leader. And I often have reason to reflect that we need people like him on the outside.
My first poem in prison was written in Rikers Island. And I didn't really think of it as anything more than just some thoughts on paper that sounded poetic. But I was encouraged after a few people read it to continue to write poetry. And eventually I submitted some of them for consideration in some poetry contests, and I won a few awards and offers to publish my poems in anthologies. I've also had a few social commentaries published, and I won semi-final in an international filmmakers competition for a screenplay, the one of which I wrote in 2008. So I've been doing pretty well as far as writing, and getting some recognition for some of the material that I've done over the years.
My son has so much to offer to this world. He had so much to tell, so much he accomplished while he's in jail. And he would love to share those accomplishments with the world. And I think that he should get this chance.
There's nothing to gain by keeping him incarcerated. He is so insightful, he is so driven, positively driven. I think he has learned so much about himself, about life, about society, that he would be nothing but a major positive force in his community.
We have to be mature enough to be able to look at situations and to say, well, maybe at the time it was understandable because there was panic about the level of crime and murder in the streets of New York, but we're 23 years smarter and more mature at this point, and I think it's a terrible injustice for Pascual Carpenter to remain incarcerated. The lessons that he's learned from his own experience make him a valuable asset to the community.
So here is somebody who's very intelligent, who has many gifts, and who would be a wonderful ingredient in our, if he were able to function in the larger culture, you know, would have something to contribute, and he's not able to. And why is that?
Please give my son a second chance. And I pray God that for me to continue having the good health, and for me to see Pascal come home, get married, have children, and for me to hold to my grandkids. That's my dream. And everything that he works so hard for him to be very successful in this life. That's my wish for my Pascal. For all the mothers that been where I have been with my son, I want them to keep the faith. I want them to do not give up on your child. Stay by them, cherish them, love them unconditionally.